Welcome back to Bible in Context,
where context is king and the author's original intent drives our interpretation.
And this time we're going to be looking at how the author has written Genesis 26 and teaching us about, like we said, Isaac's last big story that's pretty much all about him.
Yeah, and it blows me away that Isaac gets so little room in the narrative compared to the rest of the patriarchs. And I think that's a little bit intentional, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, just how Isaac's story is very much an extension of Abraham's in a lot of ways, that they go hand in hand. And we're going to see that very much in this text. There's so many similarities between Abraham's story and Isaac's story here in chapter 26.
Yeah, he becomes the extension of Abraham's story and the roots of Jacob's story.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah, he's almost like a transitional figure.
Yeah.
In the narrative, that we're seeing the promises get passed through him, but there's not much to tell about his story because it's basically Abraham on repeat.
Yeah, but we're going to see, just like you said last time, if you could sum up Isaac's story in one word, it's ditto.
Yeah.
Because it's just really, we're going to end, we're going to walk through the same steps, especially in this story that Abraham has walked through, that Sarah has walked through, and end up in the same place in the end. So, which is going to be a good thing for him, actually. It just very quickly puts Isaac in a high place and shows us a repetition of the faithful life of Abraham, I think.
Yeah, and we've already seen some similarities. You saw last week we talked about how Isaac's wife, Rebekah, was barren. And so, that brings us back to Abraham and Sarah. And so we pick up here in chapter 26. What happens first?
Okay, so now there was a famine in the land. Stop.
Where have we heard that before?
Yeah, right.
Right.
So Genesis 12, halfway through that chapter, there was a famine in the land that causes Abraham to leave and go to Egypt, which was a bad idea for him at the time.
Right.
And it even tells us, if you keep going, but there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. So the author is trying extra hard here to remind you, hey, go back and remember this story. It's going to be exactly the same.
Yeah, he's making us make the connections. He's not assuming we're going to make the connections. He's just saying, all right, let me tell you what this is all about.
Right. And so it says that Isaac went down to Gerar, which is still in the southern part of the land of Canaan. And so he hasn't really left the land of Canaan yet like Abraham did. Again, we know from the Abraham story that it was a bad idea. And verse 2 actually confirms this and again ties another link back to the Abraham story by Yahweh coming and appearing to Isaac and saying, don't go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall tell you. Sojourn in the land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring the nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Yahweh has just tied all of these promises that he gave to Abraham, one, to Abraham's obedience, in verse 5, and tied it to Isaac's obedience. It's contingent on Isaac staying in the land. If you're obedient, you stay in the land. All these promises that I gave to your father will fall on you. If not, maybe not.
Yeah, and this is a test, right? Because there's a famine in the land. Stay in the famine, and I'll bless you.
Yeah, trust me, and I will see you through it.
Right.
And so he's in the land of the Philistines in southern Canaan. That's part of the lands that he's going to be given, or his offspring will be given. And so Isaac actually, it says in verse 6, so he settled in Gerar. He stayed there. That was a good move on his part, and he trusted Yahweh and passed this test.
At least initially.
Initially, yeah, that's true. Should we say anything about verse 5?
Yeah. So, the language, this is the same language that's used later on after Sinai and after the law has been given. And you see 5 my's here, right? Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge and my commandments, my statutes, my laws. And so I believe there's several places later on where you kind of get these lists of synonyms describing the commands or the laws of God and being obedient to them. And it's typically during covenant It's like covenant language.
That's where this trips people up a lot. Is this is actually language that directly recalls the Sinai law and covenant, and so they're like, well, how in the world did Abraham keep the Sinai law? It didn't exist yet. And so that's where, again, people will start to chop and splice the text and say it's unreliable or something like that. So I think there is another explanation for what's going on here, though. So I think that, yes, the author here is trying to picture Abraham as fulfilling the law that Israel did not, obviously. At the point the author's writing it, Israel did not. And yes, there is no actual Sinai covenant law here yet, but I think he's using the same words. I mean, he's not actually saying the Sinai law, but he's just saying, like, he obeyed my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. Abraham essentially just did what God told him, and he uses that covenant language to bring the reader's mind to, oh, yeah, that thing that we didn't do. Mm-hmm. Abraham, maybe he didn't have the same laws, but, like, he was faithful and, did the same thing. He would have fulfilled it if he had it. But either way, he listened to Yahweh and all that he said. So
yeah, he obeyed the laws that were given to him. And it's, specifically, I think it's going back to circumcision. I think it's going back to, obviously, Isaac and being willing to sacrifice Isaac. In fact, this is the same language that's used by the angel of the Lord after he stops Abraham from sacrificing Isaac. He says, because you've obeyed my voice. It's the same language.
Right. Yeah, so that's calling us back to that specific event as well, which again is just trying to upload all of Israel's disobedience into Abraham's obedience.
Right.
And show him again as a faithful character, even though he didn't have the law as we understand it from the end of the Torah.
Right.
And some have gone through here and tried to show, like, oh, at this point Abraham kept this part of the law, and at this point Abraham kept this law before the law was even given, to show how he was Torah observant, but there's problems with that too.
Right.
I think this is just a literary marker that the author is getting to get the Israelite in your head to recall Israel's disobedience to the law, the statutes, the commandments, and the charge.
Right. And so we see here that Isaac, at least initially, follows in his father's footsteps. Really, he continues to follow his father's footsteps.
Yeah, he goes down to Gerar, he settles there, and when the men ask about his wife, he says, once again, she's my sister.
Right, well, and who's he talking to? Who are the men?
The Philistines.
The Philistines with King
Abimelech,
which we've seen that before too, right?
Right, yeah. This exact thing happened in chapter 21, where Abraham sold out Sarah to Abimelech.
Yeah, this chapter and chapter 21, there's so many similarities. You really almost should read them side by side.
Yeah. And again, this is again for the purpose of uploading Abraham's life into Isaac's.
Yes.
Just showing the pattern. And so they buy this for a while, but then in verse 8 here, it says, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked out of the window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah. Right, yeah, we don't know what laughing means. It's actually a play on words. Yitzhak was Yitzhaking with his wife. Remember Isaac's name means laughter.
Yeah.
And so what does laughing mean?
I think this is probably Hebrew slang for something that told him that Rebekah was not just a sister.
Yes, probably.
So, whatever that means.
A cousin. That's better. She was his cousin.
I think it's also interesting. There's kind of a progression that happens in all of these sister fibs. Okay, so in the first sister fib, that's the story where Abraham does go to Egypt because there's a famine, and he lies to Pharaoh about his wife Sarah. Same fear going on that we see here, that he feels like that he's going to die. They're going to kill him and take his wife. And in that situation, Pharaoh does take Sarah as his wife, and then all these plagues break out, right? It doesn't go well for him. Mm-hmm. In the second sister fib, God stops Abimelech from having any kind of relationship with Sarah. God protects her from that. Now, here in the third sister fib with Isaac and Abimelech, it's been a long while, and still nobody's actually touched his wife Rebekah. And what happens is Abimelech actually ends up protecting Rebekah once he figures out that it's his wife. So you see this kind of progression.
It's really cool because the last one, Pharaoh, he's not a great figure simply because of the Exodus associations. And we're meant to read those into that because it is an Exodus narrative. Abimelech, he shows up to be kind of this righteous character, and then even he becomes godlike in this story.
Right. Yeah. And it's almost like, I wonder if he kind of learned from the past experiences. And we don't even know if this is the same Abimelech or not. It could be just like a a title that was given.
Well, I think according to the story, we're meant to take it as the same, since it is kind of a name. There is kind of like the event behind the text.
Right.
This could be like a king of, the name is, my father is king, so maybe it is a title, but in this, we're kind of meant to just read it as a name. And
yeah, it does seem like they probably are the same person. And there was something else in here that made me think that too. I just know some of the commentaries that I read said that there's a debate because there's 80 years between the two stories. So either way, it does seem like this Abimelech is definitely learning from past experience.
Yeah,
and maybe even suspected that Isaac was lying about Rebekah from the beginning. Maybe he was even looking to catch them in some kind of act that proved his theory. Yeah, I don't know. All it says is he was looking through the window. What window are you looking through?
Yeah,
why are you looking through their window?
Yeah, was he outside their house? George McFly. Yeah. So, sorry, back to the Abimelech thing just real quick. It does say in chapter 20, verse 2, that Abimelech was king of Gerar. And so it kind of separates the title king from the name Abimelech.
Okay.
And gives that kind of introductory formula. This guy, king of this place.
Okay.
And so I would say from a narrative perspective, we're meant to read it as a name.
Yeah, I think there's a strong argument for that.
But anyway, that's beside the point. Okay, so let's get back to Yitzhak with his wife. Whatever the heck that means. That sounds, when you say it in Hebrew, that just doesn't sound good anyway. All right, so Abimelech calls Isaac up and, says, hey, this is your wife. What's going on? Why did you lie to us? And then in verse 10, we get the question, what is this you have done to us?
We've heard that before too, huh?
A few times now.
Yeah.
You remember where we've heard it?
Only because it's in the notes right here.
Oh, okay. Dang it. Shouldn't have given you cheats. So we've heard this in Genesis 3 when they ate the fruit. God asks Eve, what have you done? And then he asks Cain when he murders his brother, what is this you have done? And then Pharaoh asks Abraham whenever he lies about his wife, what is this you have done? Again, Abimelech asks this before to Abraham when he sold out Sarah. Again, what have you done? So we've heard this already 4 times in the narrative. And again, Abimelech is asking this question for a second time. And again, this is just a further, not only indictment on Isaac, but another link back to Abraham's first selling out with Abimelech. So Abimelech here, just like in the first one as well, he's very concerned with righteousness, and he wants to do what is right. I think that's important. And he's like, someone might have easily lain with your wife. So up to this point, that tells us no one has, like you said. Abimelech is protecting her, and through this, God has providentially protected her just like the last time. And so Abimelech warns all the people, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Now, this translation is good, but that word death, I want to touch on that for a minute. It's more literally, whoever touches this woman dying, he shall die, which is the same thing that God tells to Adam and Eve if they eat the fruit. So again, that's how he kind of becomes this godlike character. And also that idea of whoever touches this man's wife, just like Adam and Eve, when Eve rephrases God's command to the serpent, she says, we're not to touch it. And so, again, this kind of just brings us back to the garden. And like Rebekah is this forbidden fruit, not to be touched. And whoever does touch it, dying, they shall die. And also, this just kind of makes me think of, since this is a positive, protective, righteous act, a lot of people will harp on Eve saying that they weren't supposed to touch the fruit as like she is twisting the commandment and starting to forget it and stuff. I don't think that was all that bad of an idea. I think she just interpreted and was like, look, we're not supposed to touch it to take it, and maybe figuratively touch. It's not like, God didn't say we could poke it, now let's go poke it and just kind of work our way around the rule. I think it was, we're not supposed to take it and interact with it to eat it, do what you do with fruit. So I just, as an aside, I don't know, do you
yeah,
see
no,
that?
I think that makes sense, because, touches can have a whole lot of different meanings.
Right. Yeah, he says, don't touch this woman.
Right.
There's been people working with her. I don't know. They don't shake hands in that culture probably, but they're gonna touch her, but they're not going to touch her.
Right. Exactly.
Cool. So yeah, I think Eve gets a worse rap than she deserves for saying we're not supposed to touch the fruit. But with all this, again, we see that Abimelech is this Yahweh-like character. He's stepping into the protective place that Yahweh has normally performed in this story, in this pattern. So you're right, there's a development in this, and we get to see someone who is really a Gentile who's being shaped into a righteous person in a place where the elect has failed.
Right.
So again, that's just another really cool aspect to this. And again, as we're meditating on the long form story, we're learning more about how God interacts, how people are supposed to step up and how they're not. How do we be images of God as this king rules in a righteous manner? So anyway, Isaac, moving on, he has stayed in the land even after this episode. It just kind of breaks off there with, whoever touches this woman, you're going to die. And it breaks off, and Isaac, even though he sold out his wife, he has stayed in the land. He kept up that part of the deal, so God blesses him 100-fold in that year, in verse 12. And he became rich. He gained more and more until he became very wealthy, and he had possessions and flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now, we are seeing him being built up into a mixed multitude with great possessions, that same Exodus trope going on here.
Well, and you see the fruitfulness and the multiplication is starting to cause some problems too. Just like at the beginning of Exodus, the Philistines are starting to envy, and eventually they're going to ask them to leave. And it causes conflict. Yeah,
envy has been a problem throughout the Bible story so far. And so the Philistines, just like has been happening throughout the biblical story so far, they are envying the blessings of Isaac, and they've also been stopping up the wells of Abraham. And I think just with the significance of wells as kind of these post-Exodus life-giving places that almost have some Edenic connotations, maybe I'm a little off with this, but I think that we're supposed to read this as like the Philistines themselves are not great characters. Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, he's proven himself. He's a good guy. But his people, they're a little shady.
Yeah, and there was, in Abraham's story, there was an issue with the well there too, where Abraham had to confront the king about his servants stopping up one of his wells, and they end up forming a covenant after that, and they work things out. But here again, we're seeing Abraham's story on repeat.
Yeah. So once Isaac has acquired all these possessions, he's become too great. It says in verse 16 that they are much mightier than the Philistines, and that word mightier is atzam, which is the same word again used in Exodus 1 verse 7 or in 1 verse 20, saying that the Israelites have become stronger and mightier or more than the Egyptians. And so what do the Egyptians do?
They enslave them.
Right, they get afraid and they enslave them. What does Abimelech do?
He asks them to leave.
Right. I think that we should read this as, okay, why did he ask them to leave? Well, this was a righteous response in comparison to Egypt and in comparison to Abraham, who takes his nephew Lot that became greater than him and sent him away. Isaac, we're going to see, interprets this whole thing as like, oh, this was bad. You hated me and sent me away. But we're going to see again that that's not what happened here.
Right.
So he goes on and he goes into the valley of Gerar. He digs a few wells, and each time he digs a well, the Philistines are there to dispute with him to try and get the well. So again, we have the servants of the Philistines and the servants of Isaac quarreling together, again bringing us back to the conflict with Lot and Abraham and their separation. And so the cool thing is, though, Isaac, he does not put up a fight and say, like, look, this is mine, I dug it, I have the right to go to war and slaughter you all and take my well back. He's got the right to do that. But he doesn't. He just goes on and moves on to the next place until finally they don't quarrel with him over a well. And so in verse 22, he says, finally, for Yahweh has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land.
And he ends up in Beersheba.
And I think we should put some emphasis on the fact that, again, he has waited for God's provision here. Something we haven't seen in earlier narratives.
Right.
But yeah, like you said, he ends up in Beersheba. And what do you know about Beersheba?
Well, that was the place that God first met Hagar, right? It's also a place that I think, did God meet with Abraham there too? Yeah,
this has been a place in Abraham's story that's been a place where he's settled, and it's been a very Edenic setting, a very climactic setting for Abraham. And so in seeing Isaac show up at this same location, we should be uploading these Edenic, climactic, post-Exodus connotations to the story. And it's cool here that this is where God decides to show up. And it says, fear not, I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. And so he's passed the test. He's stayed in the land. Even whenever he's in the famine, when he's wandering around trying to find a place to dig a well and he's being shoved out by the people of the land, he stays faithful. He stays in the land. He passes the test, and God shows up and blesses him. And so there he builds an altar and calls upon the name of the Lord. He sacrifices, and he digs another well, and another life-giving well is showing up here in this Edenic place where he pitches his tent and decides to live for a while.
Yeah, and we've talked about the well being significant before, but I think it's worth just kind of mentioning again because it's so prevalent in this story. Just the fact that we've already seen wells play a significant role in a couple times in Hagar's story. There was a well. You saw a well give life to Ishmael. You saw a well was a place where the Abraham's servant's prayer was answered and Rebekah was found. Later on in Jacob's story, it's at a well that he finds Rachel, I believe. And I believe Moses finds his wife at a well. And so there's this very much theme, like you were saying, that a well kind of represents this Edenist, or like a mini Eden where life happens and is made and is provided for.
And most significantly about this well at Beersheba, this was intentionally a location where an Exodus had just been finished up and Abraham was at a climax, and he digs this well kind of alongside planting a tree and sacrificing and things. So it does have this like, okay, you've been delivered out of something into God's Edenic presence again, and then you're digging a well. So it kind of acquires those connotations here even more so in this location. Right.
And there's a covenant that's being made here. Yeah. Also both in Abraham's story and in this story too.
Yeah. And well, before we move on to the covenant, I think it's worth saying just real quick, because there's only a few steps to this one. We have another Exodus story wrapped up. And this time, just like we saw Sarah was given Exodus out of Pharaoh and Abimelech's house previously, this story mimics it so closely. There is another Exodus account for Rebekah. And again, we just want to highlight this because there's so many Exoduses in the book of Genesis that are priming our expectations for how the biblical story works and what is going to happen in Israel's deliverance and in our future deliverance. So in this one, just like in Abraham's day and with Joseph, whenever the family of Israel goes down to Egypt, there is a famine in the land. There is a speech that is prepared for whenever you go before the king. They're told, say that you're my sister, or in this case, Isaac says, she's my sister, and Joseph's brothers say that they're supposed to say that they are herders of livestock instead of shepherds. The king sends out the bride, or in the Exodus, the people. The people become too numerous. We saw that in the story. They come out as a mixed multitude with great possessions. There is a priestly act or a purification of a space to commune with Yahweh. We saw that as Isaac builds an altar and calls upon the name of Yahweh. There is a spring or a well that shows up in both of these stories and in all of these stories. And there is a blessing to be fruitful and multiply in these stories as well. So all of these steps that happened in past Exoduses throughout Genesis or in the future climactic Exodus happen in this story as well. And again, I fleshed that out, all these points a little bit more in the book. Check that out if you want to, but that's what we see here in this story that continues this motif through the book of Genesis as part of its underlying literary strategy as to how it communicates. So now we can move on to the covenants. At this point in the story, Abimelech went to Isaac and went and met with him with his commander Phicol. And Isaac, he says, why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away? So Isaac interpreted this sending away as a bad thing. But Abimelech actually claims in verse 29 that, no, we have sent you away in peace. It was an act of maintaining peace and brotherhood and being righteous rather than being harsh and trying to, deport him or trying to exile him. It was an act of maintaining peace from Abimelech, not something bad.
Right.
So in verse 28, the reason that Abimelech and Phicol have come is because they say, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So let us swear a pact between the two of us. Let us make a covenant. And so, again, we have the nations who have seen the blessing of Yahweh, and Abimelech specifically, he did the same thing with Abraham. He sees that Yahweh has blessed his elect, and so he wants to maintain peace with that. People there are brought and drawn to make a covenant with the elect and become covenant brothers, covenant partners with the elect family. So, again, I think we just see a pattern of God drawing the nations through blessing the elect.
Yeah, and there's so many hyperlinks back to Abraham's story. The fact that that the king Abimelech brought Phicol, that he was with him when he came to Abraham looking for a covenant. And I just thought about this. I don't know if we're meant to see this or not, but that's when Abraham confronted Abimelech about the situation with the wells. Here, Isaac doesn't confront him about the well situation, but does confront him about, hey, why'd you send us away? Like, if you want to,
right?
I thought you hated me. So there is a confrontation.
Well, and there's a whole mix and match of all these principles happening. So between the story of Lot and Abraham, of the Israelites' slavery in Egypt, and Abraham selling out Sarah to Abimelech, in this story, there are a lot of just overlaps. First we see that Lot, he grows, and then there's quarreling, and then Abraham and Lot split. And then with Egypt, we see that the Israelites grow, and they enslave them instead of sending them out. We've talked about that already. With Abraham selling out Sarah to Abimelech, there is a exodus of the wife. There is a covenant because they've seen the blessings on Abraham. And there's a dispute over wells, and then Abraham acts to maintain peace. With this story, we see the wife is given exodus, the elect family grows, and then they are sent away, just like Lot. And then after that, there's quarreling over wells, and then peace is maintained in a covenant. And so we just have a lot of these very similar steps that all get mixed and matched. It's not a one-for-one correspondence, but the same elements show up in the stories. Again, just giving us this idea of how to maintain covenant peace and loyalty. It seems like there's a pattern that if you send them away when there's trouble to maintain the peace, that's not a bad idea here in a political situation. Maybe not always best for interpersonal communication, but there's some principles to see here when there's quarreling between large groups of people. How do you handle it? The bad one is slavery. You enslave the party. That's better than
oppressing them.
Right. So just the author's knitting all of these narratives together. So after they make this covenant, they dig another well. So they made a covenant brother and maintained loyalty to this righteous person, and so there's another just high point in the narrative, and there's another well accordingly. And a reminder that this is Beersheba, so we're at this high point, and that's kind of where the story ends, with Isaac is at a high point. He has kind of made a good choice and kind of screwed up in selling out his wife, but also staying in the land. He does pass his test, ultimately. The wife is given Exodus, so they do have their own Exodus account, and then they maintain loyalty with the nations, and then his story ends with a good climax. So, like you said, with Abraham, his story just kind of says ditto and keeps going. Yeah,
and maybe we end on this as I was meditating on just the wells and how significant they are throughout the biblical narrative, and they continue to be such a significant part of the story. You come to the New Testament, and I just wonder what the New Testament Israelites, as they read like John 4:13 through 14, where Jesus is saying, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will be in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And like we read that and we just kind of pass over it, but I think back then they would have read that, and the image of a well meant so much more to them that they recognize, okay, Jesus is the Eden. He is the source of life. And
yeah, he's that source of water that ran by Eden and gave life to all the lands.
Yeah.
But still, even something more than that.
Yeah, and if you drink of him, you become a well. You become a life-giving source to the world, too.
That's good. Well, cool. Next time we can finally move on to the rest of Esau's story when he takes a couple of unwise wives. And that's where this chapter ends. Again, this ties into the next story, but we'll keep moving with that as we go.
Sounds good.